I don't think Stormgate's going to make it. I'm saying this for several reasons, but I think they can be distilled down into three. One, only 20% of players maximum go into multiplayer, and every single RTS out there is catering to that multiplayer audience, meaning they've already lost 80% of their potential audience and are competing for that 20% against established AAA titles and developers. Two, you're complying with Chinese censors. Compare that to Total Warhammer 3, which has fat, naked demons on a toy palanquin doing fart attacks. 3. You named your main faction the Resistance. How? How can you fuck up that badly? So, here's my attempt at coming up with something new yet familiar to Starcraft fans. And I found a good start to this in Civilization Beyond Earth. Now, Beyond Earth isn't a good game, and it is significantly improved by its expansion Rising Tides. But I've been playing with the Codex mod, which has really brought me back into it. And with that immersion, I've started to understand what the affinity system was going for. Basically, it's a slow technological progress that fundamentally changes what it means to be human. You can either stay as what humanity has always been with purity, mingle with nature with harmony, or transcend your flesh with supremacy. And these fit in quite nicely with StarCraft's three-race archetype. Harmony is Zerg-like, purity is Terran, and supremacy is Protoss. But they're all human. Now, I'm slowly working my way towards a video on how we could write more alien factions without them just being an unknown threat, but for now, let's just stick with them being humans. So, how should you colonize an alien world? In Beyond Earth, your nation starts out as quite a blank template outside of you should have traders, you should have specialists, etc. But the bigger thing that determines what affinity you should go down is what affinity-specific resource you happen to have a lot of. Only then can you start arguing about which colonial strategy is the best option. So let's start with that premise, but consolidate them down into one resource, which I'll be calling relics for now. So, humanity has expanded out to the stars, and in the process they found these relics left by an ancient civilization, which rapidly accelerated their technological progress to the point where they've begun to question whether remaining human is even possible anymore. As for the factions that have developed out of this contact, the first is the Cult of the Maw, our Zerg-Nurgle hybrid faction. Stemming from biologists who had found the remains of a Shoggoth, an alien symbiotic lifeform in some ways comparable to biological nanotech, they started to infuse it into their buildings and war machines before eventually infusing it into their own bodies, granting their most talented scientists effective immortality and becoming masters of biology. As for their units, imagine if Zerg started with zealots that could be upgraded with stimpaks. Our second faction is the Frostleaf Church, who are fundamentally opposed to the cult in that they discard their flesh for steel. When programmers finally hooked their minds up to the machine, they found something that they could only describe as a god inside the machine. While their lower ranks are expendable, their higher tech units are revered as instruments of the divine machine. In terms of units, imagine if Protoss had marines that created in pairs like Zerglings. Our third faction are the Crusaders of Man, who object to all changes to the noble form of humanity and seek to attain perfection in human form. While they don't build as big as the cult or the church, their technology is cultural, granting them far more control over their populations than the self-serving interests of the other two factions. Yeah, they're basically just space marines. With these three plotted out, I'd like to quickly talk about what I'd call the Blizzard roster. Basically, there's a formula for how both StarCraft and specifically Warcraft 3 handle fleshing out a roster from scratch. Each faction has 8 unit slots that they need to fill. Every faction needs a melee unit, as well as an early ranged unit that can attack air. They also need a siege weapon, as well as 2 casters and 2 air units. And in Tech 3, they need a back-of-the-box feature like battlecruisers or abominations. So great, we can just fill out these 8 unit slots and we'll have a brand new RTS that will stun everyone, right? No, this is how you end up with all the other games that have failed over the past decade. They had some cool units, sure, but there's something fundamentally missing in all of these titles that very few people are looking at. They don't have a new economic system. Every single one of the great RTS titles out there have a new economic system or twist to them that fundamentally changes what they are and how they play as a game. And economic systems are important here because that's what the game really cares about.
The number one most important thing that I will tell you in the entire series, strategically speaking. StarCraft is about having more money.
StarCraft 2's resource system has worked for a decade, but there are downsides to the system. 1. Workers take up 30 to 40% of your supply, thus limiting your army size, which is the fun part of the game. 2. People hate when the entire mineral line gets rusted in 10 seconds by 4 stupid Hellions. There's economic damage, and then there's having to replace all 24 workers for the 4th time this game. In fact, the Gates of Pyre devs have complained about this phenomenon, where literally all of the cool unit designs they come up with are pretty much just used to harass workers. And that's it. 3. What are you even fighting over? Yes, it's important to make sure you can take an expansion while your opponent can't, but the few occasions where expansions actually matter is when you have exhausted all the other bases and need to get those last few resources on the map. If you want to have action early on, well, you need something out on the map that people actually want. 4. There just isn't enough StarCraft in StarCraft. You can basically finish the game within 3 games or 30 minutes if you know what you're doing. Since 2 of my arguments focus on workers, let's start there. It makes a lot of sense to actually have worker units in the game about gathering resources and building buildings. But as power creep has set in over the past 2 decades with more damage and more area of effect, worker units have become more and more fragile, to the point where harassment became the premier design point in Legacy of the Void. That's not fun, and has no doubt contributed to the dismissal and frustration with StarCraft's design that you find as soon as you look outside of the StarCraft bubble.
They just made StarCraft!
The problem, as I see it, is not that a mining facility is impossible to harass. We can make that possible just by reducing building HP across the board. I think there are 2 angles here which I think are appropriate. One is control, as players enjoy being able to control their workers. But at the same time, this leads to the question of, well, how much control is actually fun? Which is a massive question that I don't have the answer for. The second is that if we had that, then we wouldn't have a unit that actually builds buildings. And instead we would have to go back to Command & Conquer or something. But StarCraft does have one unit that is actually quite important as a non-combat unit, the Overlord. If you've ever seen Brood War Pro play, you might have heard about the PvZ strategy called Corsair Riva. I think that's really interesting as an idea, having your supply units open to air attacks. So, in this product, let's have all the factions use an Overlord unit, a pioneer blimp that they all use to expand their colonies, as well as operating as mobile supply depots. But I don't want this to be pure StarCraft, in that I want supply to be actually interesting as a mechanic, and not just a limit that developers used to make sure that PCs didn't explode over dial-up internet. And as someone who really likes Age of Mythology multiplayer, here's how that could work out. In AOM, you start out with a town center that grants 15 population, and you can also build 10 houses with 10 population each, for 115 pop total. Then there are settlements out on the map that you can build town centers on, granting you 15 population each. You also have Fortified Town Center, that grants each town center an additional 5 population. And combining this with Corsair Overlord sniping, I hope that you can see where I'm going with this. If we say that you can only have so many Pioneer blimps from each command center, when you establish a new expansion, you increase your supply as well as the number of Pioneer blimps you can create, increasing your supply further. You and your opponent are expanding over the ability to field a big army. And having a big army, a fight against another big army, is literally why people come to the genre in the first place. Before anyone has any ideas, you can only build command centers on expansion points. Just to make that clear. As for our mineral gas resources, I'm totally fine with minerals just being a mineral extract building. But going back to our Age of Mythology and Civilization Beyond Earth example, I'm kind of interested to see what it might look like if StarCraft had trade routes. In Age of Mythology, caravans go from TC to market in order to get late game gold. And because the elements are randomly spawned, there can be some interesting decisions about where to set up your trade route from. So, combining this with StarCraft's custom built maps and command centers, We could have some kind of aerial trader that flies between TCs to gain our second resource, money. Since both our overlords and our traders are air units, that makes air superiority really important in this game. The problem with this is that it still returns to the issues that people have with workers being harassed. We can kind of solve that with having every building and civilian units having a light machine gun to dissuade a couple of mutalisks. The last resource I want to talk about here is that of research. Now, when I was younger, I saw research as a good thing, in terms of the options I could actually give to my units and Empire. As I've gotten older, however, I've realized that tech is actually very expensive, and some units are actually gatekept behind those technologies in the first place. Colossus without thermal lens, for example. So, instead, I want to take some inspiration from 4X games, where you accumulate science in order to advance your civilization. Well, considering that we established in the lore that humanity has expanded out in the cosmos, and found alien relics that have rapidly advanced the civilization, let's have it so that science is mostly extracted from these alien relics. So, you build on these relic sites that are out on the map in order to ramp up your science income. And since these relic sites are out on the map, you actually have a reason to fight over them in order to progress your research. There are a couple ways that the tech tree could look like. For example, you could have the civilization tech branches, or the various freeform ways that Endless Space 2 and Endless Legend experimented with. Instead, I'm going to bring up an idea I've talked about in another video in my hopes for AoE 4, which have obviously been dashed against the 4. This is the Hearts of Iron 4 doctrine system, where there are multiple lines of upgrades that broadly guide you into a certain direction of how you'd want to play your faction. You could start out with +1 upgrades before escalating into unlocking entirely new units and abilities. You could also attach Civilization Beyond Affinity system onto here quite easily, where you start out with a more generic Age of Empires 2 tree before you start specializing into a specific direction. I'd also like to pull in an idea I talked about in another video, which is espionage. Okay, so you know those StarCraft replay features like production, research, and income? Well, what if there was a mechanic that actually allowed you to have a quick snapshot of those features while playing the game? You can build spy centers that generate intel, which grants a snapshot of one of these features at random. Seriously, it's not that difficult to find ways to innovate the genre as soon as you step outside of it. Something that I feel like not enough people do in general. Whether or not I think these features would entirely complete the game, no they won't. But my hope is that someone out there takes my reasoning, my explanations, and tries to apply them. Of course, there's another key part of RTS games that everyone's been trying and failing at, which is the elusive idea of a good campaign. I'll try and tackle that in another video.